When my father saw the number on my screen, he froze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was the face of a man who finally realized the daughter he had dismissed had built an empire in silence. But that moment didn't appear out of nowhere. It was carved through years of quiet humiliation, of being the second choice, of hearing my worth measured against my sister's reflection. My name is Lauren Reed, and I grew up in Aspen Ridge, a small Colorado town surrounded by pine trees, snow, and expectations. My father was an accountant. He believed in numbers, structure, predictability. My sister fit perfectly into that world. She was precise, focused, reliable, the golden child. And I was the opposite, the one with potential that never quite turned into something useful. Our house always smelled like coffee and pressure. Mornings began with my father reading reports and my sister rehearsing presentations for school competitions. I would sit at the end of the table, sketching in a notebook, pretending not to notice the glances they exchanged, that unspoken language of pride and comparison. He never called me a failure directly. He didn't need to. He compared me into silence. When I turned 14, he told a family friend that my sister was the responsible one. Then he laughed and added, "Lauren? She's still trying to figure out what she's good at." Everyone laughed with him. I didn't. That night, I made a promise to myself, a quiet, invisible vow that one day I'd stop being the afterthought. For years, I tried to fit his version of success, took jobs I didn't love, followed paths that didn't belong to me, until the emptiness became heavier than the expectations. Then came a night that changed everything. My sister had just been promoted at her corporate job. My parents threw a small dinner to celebrate. As we sat around the table, my father raised his glass and said, "Some people are born to lead." He looked at her, not me. And in that moment, I realized I had spent my entire life waiting for a man who'd never see me. That realization didn't break me, it built me. Because from that night on, I stopped trying to earn their approval and started building something that would make their silence echo. Before I tell you how I turned that pain into $450,000, take a moment to subscribe. These stories come from real emotion, real scars, and quiet revenge. Your subscribe keeps them alive, and you won't want to miss what comes next. I left home a month after that dinner. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye or a final argument. Just a quiet morning, the sound of coffee brewing, and my father's voice in another room discussing numbers that didn't include me. I packed the little I owned, a few notebooks, a laptop, and a heart too heavy for 19. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of Denver, the kind of place where the walls felt paper thin and dreams had to whisper. The carpet smelled of old smoke and time, but it was mine. For the first time, there were no expectations watching me, no comparisons hiding in the next room. Just me and the noise in my head. Freedom can be lonely. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I tried everything: waitressing, data entry, selling prints of my sketches online. Nothing worked the way I hoped, but each failure taught me something small, something necessary. My father's voice still lived somewhere inside me, whispering that I was wasting time, that my sister would never struggle like this. But failure has a strange rhythm. Once you stop fearing it, it starts to sound like progress. The city was colder than I expected. I used to walk to clear my thoughts, passing glass buildings that glowed at night, wondering how people inside seemed so certain of their paths. I was still searching for mine. One night, while scrolling through design blogs, I saw a story about a woman who turned her small art shop into a six-figure business. I read it 3 times, not because I wanted her success, but because, for the first time, I saw proof that it was possible to build something from nothing. That was the spark. It wasn't a plan. It was a whisper that grew louder every day. I started learning about digital design, marketing, and e-commerce. At first, I barely understood what I was doing. Tutorials blurred into exhaustion, and my bank account kept shrinking. I worked during the day and studied at night, building mock-ups that nobody saw. There were moments I almost quit, days when the screen felt heavier than my own thoughts. But something deeper than pride kept me going. It was the quiet promise I made when I was 14, that one day, the silence they gave me would have meaning. Slowly, things began to shift. A few sales trickled in, just enough to pay a bill or two. I remember refreshing the website again and again, watching the numbers rise by single digits. Each one felt like proof that I wasn't invisible anymore. No one knew what I was doing. My father thought I was still figuring things out. My sister occasionally sent polite messages about her new promotion, her new car, her next trip. I always responded with short sentences. I didn't need to explain what I was building. Because this time, it wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about rewriting the story they'd already written for me. One small sale, one sleepless night at a time. And in the middle of that exhaustion, something inside me began to change. I stopped wanting their applause. I started wanting my freedom, the kind of freedom that comes from building a life that nobody handed you, a life you carved out of doubt and quiet defiance. That's where my real story began. Not in a boardroom or a celebration, but in a dim apartment, with a flickering screen and a girl who finally decided her silence would no longer be wasted. There's a moment in every journey when silence turns into doubt. For me, it happened one winter night when my laptop screen went dark, taking months of work with it. The fan stopped humming, the light disappeared, and the room went quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than sound. I stared at that screen for a long time. Not because I thought it would turn back on, but because I couldn't accept that it was gone. Everything I had built, the store, the designs, the plans, all vanished in seconds. Outside, snow was falling over Denver. The city lights blurred through my window like ghosts of people who hadn't given up yet. I sat on the floor, knees pulled close, wondering if I had made a mistake by thinking I could build something real on my own. For weeks after that, I moved through life in slow motion. My savings were almost gone, and the bills kept arriving like clockwork. I tried to rebuild the website, but my motivation felt thin, stretched between exhaustion and fear. Each night, I promised myself I'd keep going. Each morning, the promise felt harder to keep. Failure isn't always loud. Sometimes it just seeps in quietly, like cold through a cracked window. It doesn't break you in one moment. It drains you slowly until you wake up one day and realize you've stopped believing in yourself. There were days I didn't leave my apartment at all. I lived on instant coffee and leftover pasta, convincing myself that isolation was a form of focus. But it wasn't focus. It was fear disguised as discipline. I remember one morning in particular. The world outside was gray, heavy with snow. My sister had posted another photo online, a new office, a new title. I scrolled past it quickly, pretending it didn't hurt, but it did. It hurt because part of me still believed my father had been right. But pain has a way of reshaping you if you let it. And that day, something inside me, something stubborn and small, refused to die quietly. I opened my laptop again, borrowed from a friend, and started from zero. No money, no plan, no confidence, just persistence. I read everything I could find about resilience, design, marketing, and mindset. I stayed up through nights that felt endless, with only the sound of wind against the window for company. It wasn't inspiration that kept me going. It was defiance. Every click, every file, every design felt like an act of rebellion against everything I had been told I couldn't be. Slowly, the work began to breathe again. A few sales turned into a few more. My designs started to circulate online, shared by strangers who didn't know my story, people who just liked what I created. It felt different this time. Not like a business, but like proof that something inside me still mattered. The funny thing about success is that it doesn't start with applause. It starts with consistency, with showing up even when no one notices. I didn't tell my family about any of it. I wanted the silence to protect what I was building. For the first time, the silence wasn't punishment. It was power. I learned to love the quiet. It was where I rebuilt myself. one sleepless night at a time. And even though I still had nothing to show the world, I could feel it. Something was shifting. The girl who once cleared plates at her sister's celebration was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who had lost everything, but finally understood what she was made of. The first time I made real money, I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no music, no calls to anyone. I just stared at the screen, $1,200 in a single week, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't pride, it was relief. Quiet, steady relief that whispered, "You're not invisible anymore." I didn't realize it then, but that was the beginning of something that would change everything. The business grew like a secret garden, slowly, quietly. Every new client came through word of mouth, every project through persistence that nobody saw. I spent mornings answering messages, afternoons designing, and nights learning whatever I didn't yet understand. The rhythm of my days became sacred. The same walls that once felt like a cage now protected my progress. I stopped measuring time in hours and started measuring it in effort. The silence that once punished me became a shield. No noise, no comparisons, no distractions. Just work, steady, private work. And somewhere in that rhythm, I started to change. I stopped refreshing my sister's updates, stopped checking who was watching, who was winning. My focus shifted inward. Success, I realized, wasn't about applause or validation. It was about waking up every day with purpose, even if no one else could see it yet. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in. Nights when I wondered if I was building something real or just another fragile dream that would collapse again. But every morning, I woke up and worked anyway. Discipline became my quiet rebellion. Months turned into years, and with time, the numbers began to grow. My work started to attract attention, not because I sought it, but because people could feel the heart behind it. The orders multiplied, the income became stable, and one afternoon, sitting by the same flickering screen that had once mocked my failures, I saw it. A new client request for a full branding project, a contract worth $120,000. I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Not to believe it, but to feel it. It wasn't luck. It was accumulation. Of every late night, every tear, every silent morning I refused to quit. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't post about it. I simply closed my laptop and looked out the window. The city lights reflected off the snow, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't chasing success anymore. I was standing in it. But the strangest part was that I felt no need to tell anyone, not even my family. The old me would have wanted them to know. The new me wanted peace more than recognition. I still remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater. I thought about my father's words, about being undisciplined, unfocused, lost. And instead of anger, I felt gratitude. Because without that silence, I never would have learned how to listen to myself. The next morning, I walked to a small cafe near my apartment, the same place where I used to sit wondering how to survive another month. I ordered coffee and watched people rush past the window. For the first time, I wasn't one of them. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't chasing. I was creating. It's strange how growth feels nothing like victory. It feels calm, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. I didn't know it then, but that $120,000 contract was only the beginning. The silence that once buried me was now the sound of everything I had become. And though my family still thought of me as the uncertain one, I had already crossed the line they could never see, the line between proving yourself and becoming yourself. Success has a strange way of making people remember you. For years, my family barely mentioned my name. I existed in the background of their conversations, a quiet question no one really wanted to ask. They knew I was alive, but not much else. And I liked it that way. Their silence gave me peace. I learned to exist without explanation, without the weight of their expectations pressing against my skin. The less they knew, the freer I felt. 2 years passed like that. My business kept growing, slow but steady. I built relationships with clients I had never met, sent invoices to cities I had never seen. The numbers rose quietly, not loud enough to make headlines, but enough to change everything about how I saw myself. There was something deeply comforting about anonymity. I was successful, but invisible. No one asked for updates. No one compared me to anyone. I could finally breathe without waiting for judgment. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. It started with a phone call from my mother. Short, polite, filled with pauses that carried more meaning than her words. She said my sister had bought a new house. The same pride in her voice that I remembered from childhood bled through every syllable. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the window. The city looked different now. Taller, busier, less forgiving. I realized how far I'd come, and yet how small a part of me still longed to be seen by them. Not for validation, but for recognition. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to a family gathering. My father's birthday. I hadn't been home in years. At first, I almost ignored it. The thought of walking into that house again, the same walls that once shrank me, felt heavy. But something inside whispered that maybe it was time. When I drove back to Aspen Ridge, the mountains looked smaller than I remembered. The streets hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't the girl they left behind anymore. I was someone rebuilt from silence, from work, from faith in myself. The house looked exactly the same. Same porch light, same scent of cedar and old memories. I walked through the door like a ghost stepping back into her past. My mother greeted me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. My father was at the table, flipping through papers like time hadn't moved at all. The air was thick with the kind of politeness families use when love has been replaced by distance. My sister arrived later, glowing as always, her life wrapped in neat perfection. I watched her talk about her achievements, about her job, her house, her husband. The room clapped in quiet approval. No one asked me about mine, and for the first time I didn't need them to. I sat there, listening, smiling when appropriate, sipping coffee that had gone cold, but beneath the stillness, there was something new, a calm kind of power. They didn't know that while they were measuring her success in applause, mine was measured in freedom. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table out of habit. My father thanked me absently, still half distracted by something my sister was saying. The sound didn't sting anymore. It simply confirmed what I already knew, that his approval had stopped mattering the moment I learned to live without it. Driving back to Denver that night, I realized something important. It wasn't that my family had changed. It was that I had finally stopped trying to make them see me. The silence between us no longer hurt. It had purpose now. It protected everything I'd built, every dollar earned, every lesson learned, every night spent proving to myself that I could survive being underestimated. They still didn't know who I had become, and that was fine. Because one day, they would. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be through words, it would be through numbers. Numbers even my father couldn't ignore. I never planned to succeed this much. In the beginning, I only wanted peace, enough stability to quiet the noise of failure that had lived in me for years. But sometimes, peace becomes momentum. You start to breathe, and then you start to build. The business kept growing, quietly, like a current beneath the surface. Orders turned into contracts, and contracts turned into partnerships. My designs were being used by brands I had admired from a distance. It was strange. The world that once ignored me now moved with me, almost without realizing it. I rented a new office space downtown. It wasn't glamorous, just a small room with big windows and a single desk. But to me, it felt like a cathedral. I furnished it slowly, piece by piece. A secondhand chair, a potted plant by the window. Sometimes I'd stand there at sunset, watching the orange light spill across the floor, and think about how far I'd come from that smoke-stained apartment where it all began. The first time my account hit 6 figures, I didn't tell anyone. I just sat there in silence, letting the numbers speak louder than any apology I'd ever wanted to hear. The balance felt like a mirror, not reflecting money, but the woman I'd become. Success didn't feel loud or exciting. It felt grounded. It felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. I began to move differently. I spoke less. I listened more. There was power in knowing that my life no longer revolved around earning approval. Every project I accepted, every decision I made, was entirely mine. Still, there were moments of fear. Growth can be just as frightening as failure. Some nights I'd lie awake, afraid that everything could disappear again, that the fragile structure I'd built could collapse with one mistake. But then I'd remember all the times I'd started over, the strength that had come from breaking before. The company grew beyond anything I'd imagined. I hired help, learned to delegate, learned to trust others, lessons that didn't come easily after years of doing everything alone. Yet even surrounded by people, I stayed anchored in silence. It was my foundation, my protection. And with every success, I realized how different I had become from the girl my father once described. He had called me unfocused, lost, undisciplined. Now I was running a business that demanded precision, planning, and courage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I started traveling for work, something my younger self had only dreamed of. Airports felt like symbols of possibility, proof that my world had expanded beyond the boundaries of that small town and the narrow expectations that once defined me. Each time I boarded a plane, I thought of the version of myself who stayed up at 3 a.m., building her first design, surrounded by fear and caffeine. I carried her with me everywhere I went. But success, even quiet success, comes with a strange kind of loneliness. When you grow in silence, not everyone grows with you. Old friends drifted away, unsure how to connect to this new version of me. My family remained distant, still polite, still curious in the way people are when they're watching from the outside. I didn't resent them. I had stopped expecting them to understand. The only thing that mattered now was freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to create, freedom to exist without comparison. One evening, as I was closing the office, I looked at the view, the city alive beneath me, lights glowing against the dusk. I realized I had achieved everything I once thought I needed their validation for. And yet, the victory felt quieter than I imagined. Because true power doesn't roar. It hums beneath your skin, steady and sure. It's the kind that no one can take away, because it was born in the dark, when no one believed in you. That night, I closed my laptop and smiled. I no longer needed to prove anything. Not to my family, not to my father, not even to myself. But deep down, I knew. Someday life would bring us face to face again. And when it did, I wouldn't need to say a word. The silence would do it for me. Success doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal what it's become. It had been almost 3 years since I'd last seen my family. In that time, I had changed completely. The business that began as a side project now generated more money than I'd ever imagined. I was earning what once felt impossible, enough to make my father's old definitions of success seem small. I didn't talk about it much. There was no reason to. Silence had been my companion for so long that it now felt natural. A quiet confidence that needed no validation. Then, out of nowhere, an invitation arrived. A family gathering for my sister's birthday. I almost deleted the message the moment I read it. I told myself I had no reason to go, that I had outgrown the need to be seen by them. But the truth is, part of me wanted to stand in the same room again. Not to prove anything, but to measure the distance between who I was and who I had become. I drove back to Aspen Ridge on a cold Saturday morning. The mountains looked different now, smaller somehow. The town felt untouched by time, while I carried years of change within me. Their house stood exactly as I remembered, the same polished windows, the same porch light flickering with age. I paused before stepping inside, feeling the strange mix of nostalgia and detachment only distance can create. My mother greeted me first, polite as always. My father was seated at the dining table, reading something on his laptop, absorbed in numbers that had once defined my life. He looked older now, not weaker, just more rigid, like a man who had built his world so tightly that nothing new could fit inside it. My sister was radiant, surrounded by relatives, laughter, and stories. She spoke about her new promotion, her recent trip to Europe, the new house she and her husband had bought. The pride in my father's face hadn't changed. The admiration was still there, glowing like it always did when she talked. I sat quietly, listening, observing. There was a time when that kind of scene would have crushed me, the comparisons, the invisible hierarchy. But now it only confirmed what I already knew. I didn't belong to that world anymore. When they asked how I was doing, I kept it simple. I said work had been good, busy, steady. They nodded politely, uninterested, the same way people react to something they can't quite categorize. What they didn't know was that steady meant contracts worth hundreds of thousands. That busy meant my designs were on store shelves across the country. That good meant I had already built the kind of freedom my sister's title could never buy. I didn't need to explain. The beauty of success earned in silence is that it doesn't need to be performed. It just is. As the evening went on, I found myself studying my father more than anyone else. His hands still moved the same way when he was thinking, tapping the table softly, a rhythm I'd memorized as a child. It struck me how much of my life had been shaped by the absence of his approval. Yet now, watching him, I realized I no longer needed it. It wasn't bitterness I felt. It was clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally understand that some people will never see you until your reflection shines in something they respect. Like money, or recognition, or power. When the gathering ended, my sister handed out thank you favors with her usual charm. My father praised her thoughtfulness, my mother smiled with pride, and the scene unfolded like a loop from my childhood. I simply observed, detached but peaceful. Before leaving, I glanced around the house one last time. The photos on the walls told the same story they always had: my sister's milestones, her awards, her perfect narrative. My name was still missing from that gallery. It didn't hurt anymore. It almost made me smile, because I knew that the proof of who I had become wasn't meant to hang on their walls. It lived in the life I built, in the numbers that grew from persistence, in the freedom they could never understand. Driving back that night, the mountains faded behind me, replaced by the city lights that had become my home. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge, just a quiet satisfaction. I had spent years buried beneath their silence. Now I had mastered it. It was mine. My weapon. My peace. And deep down, I knew. The story wasn't finished. Life always finds a way to bring unfinished chapters full circle. And when that happened, the silence that once broke me would finally speak for itself. In numbers even my father could not ignore. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind that feels too quiet, too calm, like the world is holding its breath before something shifts. I had been awake for hours, sipping coffee by the window of my apartment, watching the city move below. The business had reached a place I once thought belonged to other people, the kind of success that changes how you breathe. I had just finished a contract that brought in more than my parents' combined annual income. It didn't make me proud. It made me still. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I had outgrown the need for it. But life has a way of bringing you back to the places you thought you had left behind. Not to test your strength, but to remind you how far you've come. That reminder arrived in the form of an email. My father. A message asking for help with a financial matter he didn't fully understand. It was short, formal, almost distant, like he was writing to a stranger. I read it twice, feeling a wave of old memories brushing against the edges of who I had become. Years ago, that message would have terrified me. Now, it only made me breathe deeper. He attached a document, an investment proposal, full of confusing terms and risks. I understood immediately that it wasn't a small problem. He had made a decision that could jeopardize a large portion of his savings. I could have ignored it. I could have watched the numbers collapse just as easily as I had once collapsed under his words. But something in me refused to let silence turn into cruelty. So I replied. Calmly. Professionally. I offered to help him review everything, to walk him through the numbers. We scheduled a call for the following evening. When his face appeared on the screen, I almost didn't recognize him. Time had carved its own story across his features, deeper lines, tired eyes, a stiffness that looked like regret trying to hide behind control. His tone was cautious, his movements precise. The man who once spoke with certainty now hesitated before every word. As I shared my screen to explain the document, something unexpected happened. I forgot to close my business dashboard. It appeared behind the financial spreadsheet, rows of data, graphs, and numbers that painted the story of everything I had built. He didn't speak, but I saw it. The pause, the slight tilt of his head, the tightening of his jaw. His eyes locked onto the figures glowing across the screen. $450,000. Contracts. Revenue. Growth projections. It was all there. I kept talking, pretending not to notice his silence, but I could feel it expanding through the call. That same silence that once defined my childhood, only now it belonged to me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The numbers had already answered them. I finished explaining his document and offered suggestions. He thanked me, a small, restrained thank you, but his voice was different, softer, unsure. The certainty he once wore like armor had slipped, replaced by something quieter. After we ended the call, I sat there staring at the blank screen, feeling 1,000 versions of myself exhale at once. The girl who was never enough. The teenager clearing plates at her sister's celebration. The woman who built everything in silence. They all existed in that moment. And for the first time, none of them felt small. There was no satisfaction in his realization, no vengeance, just peace. A quiet, unshakable peace. That night, I walked outside and wandered through the city. The air was cool, the streets glowing with reflections of passing cars. Everything looked ordinary, but inside, something fundamental had changed. I had spent my life chasing a kind of validation that could never exist, trying to prove my worth to a man who measured love in achievement. But now I understood. The only approval that ever mattered was my own. It's strange how victory can feel so calm. No fireworks, no applause, just stillness. Stillness that says, "You made it." The next morning, I woke up to a new message from my father. It was short. A thank you for helping him. Nothing more. But I knew it carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. He would never apologize, never admit how wrong he'd been. But he didn't need to. I had already stopped waiting for that moment years ago. Now I only wanted to live, to create, to breathe, to keep building without needing to look back. Because the truth is, I never needed to show him the number on that screen. He needed to see it. And when he did, the silence between us finally broke, not with words, but with understanding. A quiet recognition that the daughter he underestimated had become everything he taught her not to be. The way sunlight changed the color of my walls throughout the day, the rhythm of people walking below my apartment, the scent of coffee that lingered even after the cup was empty. Life wasn't rushing anymore. It was unfolding. That week, I took a break for the first time in years. I closed my laptop, turned off notifications, and stepped outside without a plan. Denver looked softer somehow, the air lighter, the sky endless. I walked until my legs ached, until my thoughts quieted, until I could finally listen to the silence inside me without fear. I stopped by a small bookstore downtown, the kind with uneven floors and shelves that felt alive. I wandered through aisles filled with stories, each one written by someone who had turned their pain into something worth sharing. And in that moment, I realized something simple but powerful. All along, I had been doing the same. Every line of code, every design, every decision, They weren't just work. They were chapters of my own healing, written in color and shape instead of words. For the first time, I saw my life for what it truly was, not a response to rejection, but a testament to resilience. Success had stopped being about the numbers on a screen. It had become about the silence that no longer hurt, the solitude that no longer felt like exile. I spent the next few weeks in quiet reflection. Work continued, but I approached it differently. There was no urgency, no hunger for more. Each day felt like a gift rather than a test. Sometimes, late at night, I would open my old folders, sketches from years ago, early drafts, broken projects. I looked at them not with embarrassment, but with affection. They were proof of my becoming, fragments of a woman who had built herself from the ground up. It's strange how forgiveness sneaks up on you. One morning, without meaning to, I forgave my father. Not out loud, not in any formal way, just a quiet understanding that he had done what he knew, and that his blindness had been his own kind of prison. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't about setting him free. It was about freeing myself from the loop of trying to rewrite the past. The truth is, I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his pride. I just needed peace. And I had finally found it. That realization brought me to tears, but not the kind that sting. They were soft tears, like rain after a long drought, the kind that cleanse instead of burn. From that day on, my mornings felt different. I woke up grateful, not ambitious. I worked because I loved the process, not because I needed the proof. I stopped chasing milestones and started living moments. Sometimes, when the city fell quiet at night, I'd think about the girl I used to be, the one who sat in that old apartment, terrified of failing, desperate to be seen. I wished I could tell her that none of it was in vain, that every heartbreak, every doubt, every long night had led her exactly here. She wouldn't have believed me then. But maybe that's how transformation works. You never realize you're growing until one day, the pain doesn't fit anymore. The silence that once suffocated me had become my sanctuary. I no longer needed to escape it. I lived inside it. And somewhere in that stillness, I found clarity. My story wasn't about revenge or validation. It was about reclamation, of voice, of peace, of identity. For years, I thought my father's silence had erased me. Now I understood it had carved space for who I was meant to become. And that realization, that quiet revelation, was worth more than any number on a screen. The morning after everything changed, I woke up before the alarm. The city outside was quiet, still half asleep, painted in that pale gray light that lives between night and day. For a moment, I lay there, listening. To the hum of the heater, the faint sound of traffic in the distance, and the silence that filled the space between all things. That silence had once terrified me. It used to sound like judgment, like failure, like the echo of every word I wasn't brave enough to say. But now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like home. I made coffee and opened the curtains. The skyline looked different that morning, though I knew it hadn't changed. Maybe it was me who had. The girl who once looked out this same window searching for direction was gone. In her place stood a woman who didn't need the world to see her to feel seen. For years, my worth was a reflection in other people's eyes, my father's approval, my sister's success, society's definition of achievement. But real worth, I learned, doesn't demand to be witnessed. It simply exists. It's built in quiet spaces, on long nights, in moments no one claps for. The day after that call with my father, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. Not his silence, but my own calm. I had faced him without fear, without the desperate hunger to be understood. That was the real victory. The number on the screen was just proof of the woman I had already become long before the money ever appeared. I didn't need him to admit anything. He didn't need to say he was proud. The truth had already settled between us, wordless and permanent, like a bridge that had always been there but had finally become visible. Weeks passed. Life went on. The company continued to grow. I started mentoring small artists and freelancers who reminded me of the version of myself that once felt invisible. Each story I heard sounded familiar. Someone doubting their worth, someone trapped in comparison, someone mistaking silence for failure. I told them the same thing I had once needed to hear. You don't have to be loud to matter. Just keep going. The right people will hear you when it's time. It felt strange to become a guide for others when I had spent so many years trying to guide myself. But maybe that's what healing is. Learning something so deeply that you can finally hand it to someone else without breaking. There were moments I still felt the shadow of the past, brief flashes of the girl waiting for validation that would never come. But instead of running from her, I started to thank her. She was the reason I'd learned to build instead of beg. One afternoon, I drove back to Aspen Ridge, not to visit anyone, just to see. The town looked exactly the same, still wrapped in its mountain silence. The old coffee shop was still there, the bookstore, the street where I used to walk when I needed to think. For a moment, I stood outside my childhood home. The porch light was off. The windows looked smaller. It struck me how much space I had once given this place, how much power I had allowed it to hold over me. Now, it was just a house. And I was free. Driving back to Denver that evening, the air felt crisp, the road endless. I thought about how strange growth is, how it doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like peace. Sometimes it feels like absence, like the sound of something heavy finally being set down. When I got home, I sat by the window again. The city lights blinked like small promises. I opened my laptop, not to work, but to look. At the numbers, the projects, the journey that had led me here. $450,000. It used to sound like a dream. Now, it sounded like a story, not one about wealth, but about becoming. I realized then that my success was never about the business. It was about identity, about reclaiming the voice I was taught to silence, about building something solid enough to stand on without needing permission. People often talk about revenge as fire, sharp, loud, consuming. But I learned that the most powerful revenge is quiet. It doesn't destroy. It transforms. It takes pain and turns it into proof that you were always more than they allowed you to be. There's a certain beauty in realizing that you no longer need to be understood, that your story can exist without validation, that your voice can echo even when you stop speaking. I still think about my father sometimes. Not with anger, not even with sadness. Just curiosity about whether he ever looks at the world differently now, whether he ever wonders what it must feel like to be proven wrong not by confrontation, but by grace. But I don't need to know, because I finally understand what real power is. It's not money, it's not recognition, it's peace. Peace that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Peace that comes from knowing you did the hard thing. You kept believing when no one believed in you, and that's the kind of success no one can measure. As the night settled outside, I closed my laptop and watched the lights flicker across the city. Somewhere, people were still chasing the next milestone, the next number, the next version of enough. I had spent years doing the same. But now I knew. Enough was already here. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, letting the quiet fill the room. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Of everything I had survived, everything I had built, everything I had become. The silence that once hurt me now held me. And in that stillness, I understood that some stories aren't meant to end in noise. They're meant to end in peace. And if you've listened this far, if you've felt something in these words, stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about resilience, about healing, about finding yourself after they told you that you'd never make it. Your subscribe keeps these stories alive, and it helps them find the people who need them most. So hit that subscribe button, and let's keep walking through these quiet victories together. One story, one silence, one truth at a time.